was owned by Australian, and now an American company have just come in to take over. And the Brazilians have just opened a new mine. So you're seeing lots of activities on the copper belt in Zambia. And then I'll be also studying next year when I go back. I just get access to study the industries inside the Chinese run zone. And they're coming in, only 14 are there. The goal is to have 60 of these Chinese companies and to use the copper ore that they get from the copper belt and turn those into manufactured copper products so that Zambia will have manufacturing capacity instead of just trapped in this single commodity export kind of mode. So there are lots of Chinese big plans going on there. So some maps, some slides to give you a kind of visual sense of what we're talking about. This is Zambia. Chimbishi is where the Chinese run zone will be. It's right in the middle of the copper belt. Surrounding it will be all these copper ores, mines, and you can see how centrally, strategically located Zambia is. You have Angola, Congo, all these are extremely rich countries in terms of mineral deposits. Angola, of course, is oil, and Congo is basically the same copper belt. It's very rich copper. Actually, the copper there is of higher grade than the Zambian copper. And the reason why the Chinese chose Zambia instead of Congo, I was told by the previous minister in Zambia, was that actually the original plan was indeed going to Congo. But once the Chinese went there and looked at the infrastructure, which was non-existent, they realized that it would be too long for them to wait and build the infrastructure, and they can't wait for obvious reasons that I will explain later. Anyway, so this is the location. This is the Chinese-owned mine. A state-of-the-art smelter that they just built and started operation last year. This is the entrance. This is just 2 months ago. They are still building the big entrance to the zone. You see the smelter in the distance, and this is their kind of blueprint. And it says here is Zambia-China Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone, and it will be totally Chinese-run. This is the township where the miners live. The football stadium dated back to the British colonialist period. Very run down. The town was really run down. And you see these grocery stores. Miners' wives, they have their own marketing activities going on. And this is a union guy that I came to know. He has some extra cash, so he opened up this grocery store. A miner in front of his house. They don't eat in the mine, so they eat a lot before they go down. For 6 hours, they'll be drinking water only underground. A China house, that's how the local people call the houses where these Chinese people live. And a Chinese manager, and look how young he is. And this is very typical of the people that you will see working in Zambia, sent from China. Many of them are university graduates from second or third tier cities. I've never met anybody from Beijing or Shanghai or these top tier cities or top university graduates from China. They're, in terms of the hierarchy of elite in China, they're the secondary or even the kind of, even lower kind of elites who would be sent to Africa. Underground, I want to show you, if you can see that slide, it's really highly mechanized today. Foreign investors since the 90s have brought in new technology, and so there'll be less and less demand for labor. But they are opening up more mines. But the idea is that the mining industry has become much more technologically advanced from the days of the British colonialists. The explosion that I mentioned earlier, at the entrance of the Chinese mine, you'll see the cemetery where the Zambian workers who were killed were buried. The hospital, it's like a state-owned enterprise. You have the Chinese-run hospital there. And this is important. I want you to pay attention here. The wire rod plant is in the plan for the Chinese to hopefully, have companies come in to make use of the copper ore, and the smelter they have already built. So they're trying to move up the commodity chain from the commodity that they extract from the ground and sort of build up the commodity chain so that they can actually export manufactured goods. That's the Chinese promise, and we'll have to observe over the next 10 years or so whether this really would happen. And my analysis is that it is structurally very likely that it will happen. It's structurally related to Chinese economic development at home. And this is the argument that I would come to in a moment. It's not because China is very kind to Africa or is not motivated ideologically. It has a lot to do with the structural development of the political economy at home. And this is something we have to bear in mind when we look at China in Africa. It has equally important to look at China in China and what is going on in Africa. So some of the pictures from construction sites that I've been touring around with people from the government, living conditions, one thing you have to look at is it's not that comfortable. Supervising Zambian workers, building schools. Again, a very young site manager. He's the head of a company on the site building roads. And Chinese are very big in this road building sector. Chinese mess hall, eating. And the guy with the hat was the president of Zambia, who just removed from power in the election. But he came to the opening ceremony. Again, look at this guy. He's the site manager, very young. So there are lots of young managers there. I'll have a lot to say about them later. Again, foreman, working with Zambian workers. Zambian workers complain a lot about exploitation. But one thing that they also have talked to us a lot about is how much skill Chinese managers and foremen want to teach them and are teaching them on site. And something that they don't ever mention about the South Africans or the Zambians. The Chinese are very good at skilling people, and that has lots of historical records. When they were in Zambia building the Tazara Railroad, we have fine historiographies on that period that says, again, transference of skills is somehow a very important consequence of Chinese presence there. Nighttime recreation. I want you to pay attention. I'll come back to this picture. How they live. 3 people to a room. These are managers, Chinese managers, foremen, and they live. If people who have been to China or study Chinese factory workers, you realize that they live mostly in a similar situation like Chinese migrant workers, with the kind of crowded and no air conditioning and very basic. And I'll come back to this point later. It's very important. And then my Zambian workers, they're cooking lunch, if you can see, very basic meal and very, usually they don't have meat. Laboring 12 hours, 14 hours a day, just eating some shima, which is a kind of corn-based staple, and then have some vegetables, and that's all. Okay, now before I go really into the details of my findings in the construction industry, I want to sort of flesh this out at the very beginning. When we talk about Chinese capital, there's a hierarchy of Chinese capital that is active in Africa. It's not just one kind. At the very top, you have money coming directly from the Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also from policy banks, mostly the China Development Bank, which has been the major source of loans to many of these construction projects, and also the Special Economic Zone. The Special Economic Zone is not a government-funded zone. It's a bank-funded zone. And the bank is a policy bank, but it is a commercial bank also, in the sense that they are really out there to look for profit. The Chinese, I think, have found a way where they combine politics and profit in a way that don't see the contradiction between these two. So that's the highest level. And then we have also centrally owned SOEs, state-owned enterprises, active in the construction industry, also in copper. And then another level is the provincial SOEs, and then private enterprises. And then you have these entrepreneurial enterprises consisting of, mom and pop shop and just, single individual working with the family members. The reason why I like to talk about this at the beginning is that most Africans have no idea that there are all these different kinds of Chinese capital. In their mind, all Chinese capital is state capital. And this is important when I come back to the point why they always single out the Chinese. And the point I found interesting is that there is intense competition amongst these different kinds of companies in the construction business. And the state, the government, for example, the embassy in Zambia, has no control over the private ones. They have control over the government ones, and not even the provincial ones. They really have very little leverage on them. And so when the shooting incident happened, the coal mine incident where they shot the workers demanding for higher wages, that was a private company. And everybody was complaining to this Chinese embassy after that happened. And the Chinese embassy just came out and said, we had no control over them, which is true. These are private firms. And in terms of capitalization, most importantly, in terms of what they count as profit, these guys have very different understanding and calculation about profit. The time frame for profit, what really counts as profit, is revenue profit or profit. And also the constraints on them are very different. I have no time to go into this, but I just want to give you this idea that when we talk about Chinese capital, we need to know exactly which part of the hierarchy they belong to in order to understand their behavior and to sort of limits to their behavior, to what they can do in Zambia. So give you some finding from this national survey that I've been doing, collaborating with the government there. We've been going around the country to visit construction sites and contractors. We are comparing Chinese, South African, and Zambian contractors. So remind you again, my question is, what is peculiar about the Chinese? What is Chinese and what is capitalist if we look at Chinese firms? So what do we find? Quite surprisingly, and contrary to the kind of general perception that the Chinese are the worst employers, we find similar regimes of production across these firms. Casualization or informalization is rampant, is everywhere. Most people do not have a contract. Many of them work as casuals. And if somebody say, I'm a permanent worker in this construction firm, what it means is I have a 1-year contract. 1-year contract is permanent. Now, this is the extent of casualization. It tells you how general it is, a phenomenon when people would think of themselves as permanent if they have 1-year kind of security, legally protected kind of legal contract. And this is across the board. We're talking about South African companies as frequently as in Zambian-owned companies towards their own workers. Another very important feature that we find across the board is the minimum wage, which is pegged at a very decided by the government as a very low level. This year is an election year, so they have raised it from $1.5 per day to about $3 a day. And that basically is the minimum wage, but in reality is the maximum wage. Because it's legally, you're only legally required to give your worker, $3 a day. So everybody's giving that and no extra. But it's legally a poverty wage, because if you look at the living wage kind of standard, there is a what they call food basket kind of wage standard that NGOs have produced, and is way above the legal minimum. So basically the legal minimum wage is legal poverty wage. And it's across the board. The Chinese are no worse than other companies. Color bar, except in Zambian firms, because Zambians are kind of managing Zambian workers, so you don't see a color bar. But in South African firms and Chinese firms, and we have Indian firms in the mix as well, although they're not very prominent, there are very few of them. We have a Serbian firm, we have a Lebanese firm, and across the board you see foreign capital would bring in their own managers, financial management and whatnot, at that kind of middle or upper level. And then gradually further down you have Zambians. But basically